It seems like a really short chapter, and we'll probably zip right through that. And then when I was done with my notes, I had 11 pages. I was like, golly, am I going to get done with chapter 3 today? Who knows, maybe I'll read really fast and we'll be done early again, and I'll be questioning, gee, should I have prepared notes for chapter 4? So you can see, I keep things really simple. I stuck a slide in to remind me, here's where I want to start today. So we're going to go ahead, I'm going to read chapter 3 all the way through, and then we'll come back and look at it, break it down. So I'm reading from the ESV. After these things, King Ahasuerus, I know I don't pronounce it like Roger does, I'm sorry, promoted Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, and advanced him and set his throne above all the officials who were with him. And all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage. When the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why do you transgress the king's command?" And when they spoke to him day after day and he would not listen to them, they told Haman in order to see whether Mordecai's words would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. And when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage to him, Haman was filled with fury. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, so as they had made known to him the people of Mordecai, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. In the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast pur, that is, they cast lots, before Haman day after day, and they cast it month after month, till the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, "There is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of every other people, and they do not keep the king's laws, so that it is not to the king's profit to tolerate them. If it please the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who have charge of the king's business, that they may put it into the king's treasuries." So the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, "The money is given to you, the people also, to do with them as seems good to you." Then the king's scribes were summoned on the 13th day of the first month, and an edict according to all that Haman commanded was written to the king's satraps and to the governors over all the provinces, and to the officials of all the peoples, to every province in its own script and every people in its own language. It was written in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed with the king's signet ring. Letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with instructions to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. A copy of the document was to be issued as a decree in every province by proclamation to all the peoples to be ready for that day. The couriers went out hurriedly by order of the king, and the decree was issued in Susa, the citadel. And the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was thrown into confusion. So that's Esther chapter 3. As we continue on this study, not really looking for a show of hands, but just a question. To me, it really helps, for me personally, in my study of this particular book, to read it start to finish, the entire thing. I timed myself the other day because I wanted to know what I was asking you to do. It wasn't a fast read, so if I'm reading the newspaper, I can read it really fast because I'm really interested in picking out about 2 or 3 things out of an entire article. I don't really care what the rest of it, the fluff around it was. But when it comes to this, I'm going to slow down and I'm going to read it so that I understand it. It took me 27 minutes to read the entire book. I don't think that's asking too much, about a half hour in preparation. So I'm suggesting to you as we go forward, consider reading the entire book and then go back and just reread the chapter that we're going to do that particular week. Because as we're going to see today, there's so much that plays out that we're reading that's going to come into play later in the book. And it's really good to refresh our minds what all those things were. I'm also going to back up and pull something in from a couple of weeks ago. This is from chapter 1. And I just want to point out that when we begin this story in chapter 1, who are Xerxes or Ahasuerus' trusted confidants, right? And at that time, he has 7 who are mentioned. They're Carshena, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Maris, Marsena, and Memucan. Memucan was the one who suggested what he should do about the situation, if you remember. Notice we don't see the name Haman anywhere in there. Now we're going to move about 5 years from the time we are in chapter 1 to chapter 3, so people come in and out of favor in anybody's leadership. But notice that Haman has been elevated above all of these people, and yet he wasn't even one of the 7 who were kind of had the king's ear here 5 years ago. So Haman's risen apparently pretty quickly in favor with the king. So we have verses 1 and 2. This is where we learn about Haman being promoted. He's referred to as an Agagite. We find out who his father is. We really don't know anything else about his father, but we also know that it's incredibly common in this era for people to be referred to by their own name and then something about their lineage so that people can identify them. And we're told that all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down to him and paid homage, for the king had commanded so, but Mordecai was not among those who were going to bow down. So I have a couple pages of notes on that. So Haman is a trusted advisor to the king, and he's raised to a position that's second only to the king. Can you think of another example from the Old Testament where we encounter a similar situation? I think back to Joseph. He's raised to be second only to Pharaoh. There's a huge difference here, though. Joseph was a man of good character and a wise leader, and we're going to discover as we go through this book that really cannot be said of Haman at all. He is just the opposite. He's a man that you definitely don't want as a leader. So Haman is not a man of good character, and yet we all know that the world often fails to value character very much when it comes to leadership. Haman is identified as an Agagite, a descendant of Agag of the Amalekites. The conflict between Jews and Amalekites goes back a long way. If you remember when they were leaving Egypt during the Exodus, Amalek refused to allow them to pass through his land. Later on, when we get to chapter 17 of Exodus in verses 14 through 16, we have this command from the Lord. The Lord said to Moses, "Write this as a memorial in a book and recite it in the ears of Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven." And Moses built an altar and called the name of it, "The Lord is my banner," saying, "A hand upon the throne of the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation." There's a reason I quoted that scripture to you. We're going to discover that part of the issue here between Mordecai and Haman is about this very long battle, this very long frustration between these two peoples. We now know that Haman is an Amalekite, and we can kind of guess then how Mordecai is going to feel about him. Let's see, so Agag was a name that many leaders of the Amalekites had, so it was a name often passed down and reused. Suggests to us that Haman here is a descendant possibly of leadership within the Amalekites. So we read of one in particular who's named Agag. He's in 1 Samuel 15, verses 1 through 3 and 7 through 9. This is when Saul is commanded to go and utterly destroy the Amalekites. He's to leave nothing, to take no plunder, nothing. Comes back, and Samuel meets him, and we're all familiar with the terms of what is this I hear, the bleating of the sheep and the lowing of the oxen. But that's not the only thing that he failed to do correctly. So in verse 1 it says, "And Samuel said to Saul, 'The Lord sent me to anoint you king over his people Israel. Now therefore listen to the words of the Lord. Thus says the Lord of hosts, I have noted what Amalek did to Israel in opposing them on the way when they came out of Egypt. Now go and strike Amalek and devote to destruction all they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey.'" There's really nothing too hard to understand about that. There's really no wiggle room there. Gave him very clear instructions. And yet in verse 7, we pick up where it tells us, "And Saul defeated the Amalekites from Hivajah as far as Shur, which is east of Egypt, and he took Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive, and devoted to destruction all the people with the edge of the sword. But Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep and of the oxen and of the fatted calves and the lambs and all that was good, and would not utterly destroy them. All that was despised and worthless they devoted to destruction." So here we have their king, Agag, taken captive, contrary to what God had told Saul to do. So I want you to keep this story, this history in mind as we go through the next few chapters. And as we look at the behaviors of both Haman and of Mordecai, ask yourself if this history doesn't have something to do with how that interaction goes. Regarding verse 2, while the Old Testament does not record commands specifically that tell us that does record commands that we're not to worship other gods, we really find no prohibition against bowing down before other men when it comes to issues of respect. We have many examples where godly men bowed down to other people, calling them Lord, not Lord in the sense of God, but Lord in the sense of someone to be respected. And that was entirely appropriate. There was no issue with that. So we don't have a prohibition of Mordecai bowing down to Haman. So the fact that he claims he doesn't do it because he's a Jew, which we're going to read later, really isn't about a prohibition in the law. Mordecai refuses to show this honor to Haman, and I think it's perhaps because he was aware of his character, or perhaps knowing that he is an Amalekite and the history that the Jews have with the Amalekites. If you hate a people, it's really going to be tough to bow down and show them respect, is it not? Matthew Henry makes a really interesting observation about this in his commentary, and I'm going to share that with you. He says, "I wonder what the king," meaning Xerxes, "saw in Haman that was commendable or meritorious. It is plain that he was not a man of honor or justice or any true courage or steady conduct, but proud and passionate and revengeful. Yet he was promoted and caressed, and there was none so great as he except the king." He says, "Princes' darlings are not always worthies." Matthew Henry wrote kind of Old English, so some of his sayings are kind of interesting and at times challenging to understand necessarily what he meant. But it's a good observation. Here is Haman, a man that we can see from the stories was not a man of good character, and yet he had great favor with King Xerxes. What does that tell us about Xerxes? But I guess we also shouldn't be that hard on Xerxes. We see that today just as easily, don't we? People have their cronies, people they've come up through the ranks with, we say, been with them forever. And by the time they reach powerful positions, those cronies are such a set part of their lives that whether they're good people or not, they're people who are trusted and given power. Chapters 3 through 5. Then the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why do you transgress the king's command?" So in verse 1, verse 1 did not specifically mention a command or edict from the king that everyone had to bow to Haman. That was not said in verse 1. But verse 2 does tell us that the people did so because the king had commanded it. They're confused why Mordecai would fail to comply with a command from the king. This would also suggest, though, that in all other respects, Mordecai has been a responsible and loyal citizen. If Mordecai were rebellious against the king, this one particular act wouldn't really draw attention. They would just attribute it to, that's that Mordecai who always doesn't do what the king says. So it suggests to us that Mordecai has been a pretty faithful and loyal resident and citizen of King Xerxes to this point. Verse 4 says, "And when they spoke to him day after day and he would not listen to them, they told Haman in order to see whether Mordecai's words would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew." Mordecai was apparently consistent in his behavior, and he refused to bow to Haman day after day as he appeared. Now the question we want to ask is, and we won't get an answer, but the question I'd like to know is, are these men who talk to him day to day his friends? Are they, Mordecai, what are you doing? You're going to get in trouble. You need to bow down to him. That's the rule. We're all doing it. You can join us. Or are they people who are looking for an opportunity to suck up to Haman? Hey, here's this guy over here who's not bound. If we go tell Haman, that'll be points for us with him. Keep in mind as we progress through the story, it would appear that Haman doesn't yet realize that Mordecai is not giving him this honor. So apparently he hasn't seen this himself. Now that, I guess, isn't that unusual. If you're going by in a crowd of people's around, you're probably paying attention to all the people who are, shouting hooray for you and ignoring the people who aren't. So maybe he just hasn't spotted Mordecai yet. Mordecai has explained to the people who've questioned him that he's doing this because he is a Jew. But the verse doesn't tell us if he went on to explain why he wasn't doing this because he was a Jew. The initial reading of it would suggest that there was some law that prohibited him, but we know that's not the case. So in reality, we go back to that idea of how Jews felt about the Amalekites, and he probably just can't bring himself to pay respect to an Amalekite. Verse 5. So verse 5, when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage to him, Haman was filled with fury. So these servants of the king have reported the situation to Haman. They've made him aware of what's going on. And they're really curious to see exactly what he's going to do about this. Now that Haman knows to watch for this Mordecai, he sees for himself that he does not bow down and pay homage as the rest do, and that makes him angry. Used to be a saying that when you said somebody was angry, they'd say, "No, I don't get angry, I get mad or upset or whatever." Haman was just plain angry. So Haman's shortcomings take front stage here. We see his pride and arrogance in insisting that everyone has to honor him. He's not satisfied with the masses honoring him. Everybody has to. He lacks humility and meekness, two characteristics that God values. His insecurities work on him. To him, he's less of a man if someone is not honoring him. His opinion of himself is based on the people around him and how they treat him. He's short-tempered. As children of God, we're called to be slow to wrath and long-suffering like God is toward us. So again, he's everything opposite of what God would ask his people to be. And I wanted to mention that as Christians, our only measure of whether we're succeeding or not, whether we're important or not, is whether or not we're striving to please God. We're never going to be perfectly successful at that, but if that's our goal, to always do our best to please God, then regardless of what the people around us think, we're successful. Verse 6. So here's the ESV. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, so as they had made known to him the people of Mordecai, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. I was looking for other translations. I always read multiple translations when I'm doing this. And I came across one that I thought really gave the meaning of the verse much more clearly. So to me, the wording in the ESV was maybe a little bit ambiguous, whereas this translation, the New Living Translation, really spelled it out the way I think it was intended. He had learned of Mordecai's nationality, so he decided it was not enough to lay hands on Mordecai alone. Instead, he looked for a way to destroy all the Jews throughout the entire empire of Xerxes. So the wording here that we had in ESV is very similar in a lot of translations. It's not incorrect, but it leaves room for more than one understanding of what is being said here. We might draw the meaning that Haman was not willing to confront Mordecai on his own when it says that he disdained from engaging him alone. And the idea of Haman being somewhat of a coward would actually really fit in easily with the picture we're getting of Haman's character, would it not? So that'd be an easy interpretation to come to. So I cited here the New Living Translation that kind of gives a different perspective, or I think really gets to the real meaning of the verse here. Haman, like Mordecai, is well aware of the history between his people and the Jews. They've already told them that he is not doing this because he's a Jew. So Haman knows Mordecai is a Jew as this all transpires. Do you not think that Haman has just as much issue with Mordecai now because he knows he's a Jew as Mordecai had with Haman because he knew he was an Amalekite? The fact that he knows that Mordecai is a Jew simply adds fuel to the fire of all the things that he's already dealing with. Haman is not going to be satisfied with simply getting even with Mordecai. He's going to use this opportunity to eliminate a people he considers a personal enemy or an enemy to his peoples, though there are no enemies of the kingdom itself. We have to think back again. Haman's been made the number 2 man in the kingdom. He's a leader. In our expectations, leaders set aside their personal feelings and they do what's best for the people they lead, right? Haman's not that guy. We expect our leaders to do what's good for the kingdom or the nation and not to use their powers as an opportunity to punish others over some prejudice that they may carry. It shows that people really don't change. We see this today. If we look at places like China, for instance, and the things that are going on with the Uyghurs there, how they treat them over their prejudices toward them. We look at how they treat the Tibetans. Again, considered all part of their nation, and yet they treat them so differently, right? So things really haven't changed. And we really don't have to look all that far to see similar treatments. We can look within our own nation. And while the physical attacks aren't necessarily as obvious or as frequent, we see the abuse of power as either party is in control, trying to marginalize other parties' other voices, whichever it may be. That's not correct. That's not what leaders are supposed to do. They're supposed to lead for the entire country, not just a segment of it. Verse 7, in the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast pur, that is, they cast lots, before Haman day after day, and they cast it month after month until the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. So Haman begins working out the details of the plan that he's going to hatch to how he's going to get his revenge here. Commentators offer different understandings of the exact meanings of what we read here in this verse, some suggesting that he spent the better part of 12 months casting these lots to decide when he was going to go about it. The more reasonable understanding is that they cast lots against the possible days and the possible months in which it would occur. Not that this took nearly 12 months to work out, but that they cast lots to determine which month, which day this plan would be carried out. In either case, how confident Haman must have been to have worked out the date before he ever even talked about this with the king. That's confidence. Haman's a superstitious man. He relies on the casting of lots to choose the date, believing that the gods that they believed in were directing the actions through the process of casting lots, and thereby the gods then would support his actions because they had helped direct it. They arrive at the time for this to occur at Adar, the 12th month, and here we are in Nisan, the 1st month. That's an important factor. I think if we look at this honestly, God probably had a hand in this. We're going to put it off so that there's time to come up with a way to, thwart this plan. Verse 8, then Haman said to the king Ahasuerus, so he gets an audience. He actually is one of the few who can just walk in and talk to the king. That's very unusual. But there is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of every other people, and they do not keep the king's laws, so that it is not to the king's profit to tolerate them. Haman's ready to take his plan before the king. How many times do you think he probably practiced this with his advisors to get it just right? As is consistent with his character, Haman is going to use a series of half-truths, selective omissions, and outright lies in his attempts to persuade the king. Doesn't surprise us a bit when we consider Haman's character, does it? He says, there is a certain people, but he doesn't say it's the Jews. He just says there's a certain people. Well, that could be 2-3 dozen people who are insurrectionists, or even maybe a couple hundred people who are gathering together because they don't like the current leadership. He's not really specific. Doesn't say how many there are, doesn't say who they are. Just that there's a certain people. So there's a half-truth. It says they're scattered among the peoples. But that would be true of any nation that the Babylonians or the Persians or Medes had, well, more so the Babylonians. Persians and Medes didn't tend to uproot people that they conquered. But the Babylonians, that was their standard operating procedure. We conquer you, we're going to move all the people out. We don't want you to feel like this is your homeland or that you have an affinity to this particular area. You're part of the kingdom now. You're going to live where we tell you to live. So everybody who lived throughout the kingdom at this point, since the Persians had conquered the Babylonians, were probably uprooted and scattered throughout the kingdom and didn't live where they originally did. So there's a truth used in a convenient way. He says they have their own laws. They do indeed have laws that they've been given by God, and they follow them. I think of Daniel praying 3 times each day. That was something that was, not common to the kingdom, but it was something that Daniel did because it was part of God's expectation for him, right? But it's a general falsehood. Their laws don't cause them to disobey the king or his laws. They have laws in addition that they follow. Now, there are times that these people, like us, like we today, may be called to rebel against certain laws because they're contrary to what God tells us to do. But for the most part, these Jews were very good citizens. They simply had extra laws that they followed in addition. If he's questioned about it, well, what do you mean? What laws do they refuse to obey? Well, here's this Mordecai guy. You decreed that everybody had to bow down and pay me homage. He doesn't do it. See, they don't follow your rules. They don't follow your laws. He's ready with an example if he has to have it. But this is a one-off, not something that's consistent with their behavior. In general, these are loyal citizens. And he says it's not profitable for the king to tolerate them. This is an outright lie. They do no harm to the kingdom. They don't resist it. They don't fight against it. They don't attempt to overthrow it. They're good citizens who work hard, and just like everyone else in the kingdom, they pay their taxes. Isn't that what you'd consider profitable for the king? A good citizen who pays their taxes. On the other hand, Haman wants to get rid of all these people, so he's going to get rid of that tax revenue. That would seem to be unprofitable to the king, not the fact that these people exist. But you note that he hasn't told him who the people are or how many of them there are. So again, the king may simply think that this is a few hundred people who are, fighting the kingdom or going against the kingdom. It's not a big loss, and it helps us in the long run. So he's going to go along with it. I'm not going to suggest that absolves Xerxes of any problems here. He's got his own problems. But we've got to keep in mind what he's maybe thinking is going on here. Verse 9, if it please the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who have charge of the king's business, that they may put it into the king's treasury. That's a lot of money. Haman requests a decree from the king in the matter. And we've talked about this, Roger has mentioned this many times. In the Persian Empire, once a king made a decree, it could not be undone, even by the king himself. The king was expected to be infallible. That's why this rule was in place. So there was no reason to be able to repeal or change a decree once it was issued. This practice also tied the hands of subsequent kings. So as a king, you couldn't change what the previous king had done simply by removing a decree they had made. Compare that to our own modern system where presidents issue executive orders with no real intent to enact the law. As administrations change, they simply rescind the ones they don't agree with and act ones to accomplish their own priorities. Haman has requested a decree that these unprofitable people be destroyed. That's a big step. He's not suggesting enslavement. He's not suggesting banish them. He's suggesting annihilating them. Commentators have varying ideas regarding Haman's offer of the 10,000 talents of silver. Some believe Haman anticipates the king may consider that the lost taxes resulting from such of an event, and the money here is meant to offset those lost taxes. Others suggest that Haman anticipated the king would never require it of him, but the offer would certainly make Haman seem like an incredibly dedicated servant, willing to do whatever was best for the king. I just want to help you out. I want to make sure you're reigning forever. I'll pay it out of my own pocket to make this happen. Others suggest Haman was prepared to provide the money, anticipating that he was going to get far greater gain from all these spoils that were to be taken from the Jews than the 10,000 talents he was going to put in to make it happen. We'll learn more about that in verse 13. Verse 10, so the king took a signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. So here we get to Xerxes' failures in all of this. So to Xerxes' shame, or that's the other name for Ahasuerus, he does not probe for details or look into the matter himself. What people is Haman talking about? What laws are they that they disobey? Is disobeyment of these laws really deserving such a serious punishment? Sadly, like far too many leaders, Xerxes is not interested in the duties and responsibilities of his position. He's interested in the benefits and the trappings that go along with the position. He's too agreeable to leaving the details of ruling to others. and much too quick to accept the opinions of advisors without considering them or proving them out. Giving Haman his ring essentially gives Haman authority to do whatever he wants in the king's name. Kind of scary. But is that terribly different than some of the cabinet positions and things we see today? Verse 11, and the king said to Haman, the money is given to you, the people also, to do with them as seems good to you. This gives some support to the understanding of some commentators that the king here would decline to accept the money from Haman. He may be thinking it's a relatively small group of rebellious people. There's no need for Haman to replace the lost revenue since it's really going to be a small amount. Xerxes has complete trust in Haman and is obviously misplaced. He's given him complete authority of the matter and does not even expect a report of what is to come. Tells him, go, do what you think is best. Not even expecting a follow-up from that. This fault in leadership is just as evident today. Leaders today are just as apt to entrust great authority to people who are not necessarily worthy, and they're just as bad at judging character as Xerxes was in his day. Commentator Matthew Henry offered this observation: miserable is the kingdom that is at the disposal of such a head as this, which has one ear only, a nose to be led by, neither eyes nor brains, but scarcely a tongue of its own. We are going to get through this chapter. Verse 12. Then the king's scribes were summoned on the 13th day of the month, and an edict, according to all that Haman commanded, was written to the king's satraps and to the governors over all the provinces and to the officials of all the peoples, to every province in its own script and every people in its own language. It was written in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed with the king's signet ring. The royal scribes are summoned to record a proclamation that's going to be dictated by Haman. It's going to go out throughout the entire kingdom, and it's going to bear the king's authority by virtue of the signet ring. It's done in the first month, presumably that same first month as we encounter in verse 7, where he consults his advisors to cast lots to determine when this should be accomplished. This would mean he wasted no time in presenting it to King Xerxes, and no time in sending out the orders. The order is sent out to the leaders, the satraps and the governors in every province of the kingdom. It would take many scribes to write each of the letters with the same instructions, but in the various languages native to those various provinces. As permitted by Xerxes, though, it is written by Haman. It goes out in Xerxes' name, sealed with his signet ring that he gave Haman in verse 10. This was the sign to all that the message contained in the letters was by the authority of the king and could not be questioned. Letters were sent by couriers to the king's provinces with instructions to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. Once the letters are all written, they're dispatched via men on horses. The instructions were quite clear. All Jews, men, women, and children, were to be killed throughout the kingdom on a specific date, the 13th day of the 12th month. It's going to be precisely 11 months after the scribes were called to Haman. Remember, he determined this date by the casting of lots back in verse 7. We might wonder if the non-Jews of the kingdom would be willing to carry out these orders. That's a pretty big order to send out. Most would obey, knowing that the consequences for failing to do so would fall upon them. But Haman includes an incentive. They're to take the plunder, all the possessions of the people that they're to destroy. Now, that doesn't mean they get to keep it all. He's expecting the plunder, but let's be realistic. When people take plunder, you think they're going to give it all to Haman or they're going to keep some for themselves? They're going to keep some. Haman knows that. He's already anticipated that. He just sees this as an incentive to them. If you're wavering on doing this, hey, you can profit by this. Verse 14. Oh, sorry. We were already on verse 14 there. A copy of the document was to be issued as a decree in every province by proclamation to all the peoples to be ready for that day. Every area of the kingdom received a copy and was to make it known to all citizens. Yes, even the Jews would know about the decree. It was not kept secret from them. All the nation was to be ready to act on the day specified. This is an important part of the events as we see the entire story unfold, that it's so far out and that everybody knows when it's going to happen, including the Jews. Verse 15. The couriers went out hurriedly by order of the king, and the decree was issued in Susa the citadel, and the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was thrown into confusion. So while the riders went out quickly to deliver the letters to all the provinces, the decree was also issued in the capital itself, Susa. Look at the contrast in the states of minds that this creates. The leaders were merry. We read that they're drinking wine together. It's a celebration in their minds. Xerxes, believing he was doing a good thing because he was ignorant by his own choice of what exactly was going to happen. Haman was merry because he believed the things he wanted, revenge against the Jews, were now within his grasp. It was just a matter of time till his lust was going to be fulfilled. The city, on the other hand, the citizens, they're confused and dismayed. The Jews would have been sad and fearful, obviously. That would have been a scary time to think about it, especially when the proclamation came out. While the non-Jews would not understand exactly why this was happening. Usually a proclamation you could at least understand, okay, we're going to war with this country. Okay, they're not part of us, we're going to take it over, that makes sense. Or these people are rebelling against the law, we've got to stop that. That makes sense. But there's no explanation why this is being done to the Jews. These were their fellow citizens, and in many cases their friends. They had lived with them and worked with them peacefully for all these many years. We're well over 100 years since the captivity of Judah and taken into Babylon. So it's not like they're new arrivals. They've been part of this society for over 100 years, raising children for generations down the road from their arrival. No reason is given, no opportunity for justice is provided. Generally, when somebody is accused of something, they at least have the opportunity to prove that they didn't actually do it. There's nothing like that here. There's no consideration of whether individuals are guilty or innocent of whatever they're accused of. They're all just presumed guilty. And while these non-Jews did not have the benefit of God's word to guide them, many of them had a solid sense of right and wrong, justice and injustice, and this decree simply had to be incredibly difficult to even accept, to be told. Well, how about that? We made it with a minute to spare. So that is chapter 3. Again, I will encourage you before next week, try to read the entire book and then go back and reread chapter 4 to be ready for our study next week. Thank you.